Chair recognizes the senator from the Berkshires, Mr. Downing.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and through you to the minority leader, and I thank him for his support of these efforts, along with the distinguished Senate President Pro Tem and others who have worked so hard, both on the larger comprehensive climate adaptation and management plan, but also in particular on the issue of net metering, and also really more broadly on the issue of how Massachusetts tackles the issue of climate change and how we do so through our energy policy. As the distinguished minority leader made reference to, the issue that is before us, the sole issue that is before the Senate right now, is the issue of net metering. Before getting into a discussion about what I have proposed in response to the House's response to our net metering amendment, I do think it is worth pointing out some of the history and the background around net metering. Net metering has been in the Commonwealth for solar in particular, but for distributed energy more generally since the 1980s. At that point, in the 1980s, the 90s, and the early part of the first decade of this century, the net metering program for individual projects was capped at 60 kilowatts for a project, and the reimbursement rate was only the wholesale rate of electricity. In all of that time, in the 80s, the 90s, and the first part of the 21st century, we only saw the development of 2 megawatts of solar in Massachusetts. In 2007 and 2008, this Senate, the legislature, in partnership with the Patrick administration, signed into law and implemented sweeping clean energy legislation, the Green Communities Act, the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Green Jobs Act, a significant environmental bond bill, and any number of other pieces of legislation, all aimed at putting us on the track here in Massachusetts to do what we all believe to be is our generational responsibility, to make sure that we are passing on to our kids and our grandkids, to future generations, a Commonwealth that leaves less of an impact on the environment, one that is sustainable both environmentally and economically. That was the goal of those pieces of legislation. One component of the Green Communities Act was a change in our existing net metering policy. We changed that policy by saying that a project could be as big as 2 megawatts and still be a net metered project. We also said that the reimbursement rate for net metering would change under our policy. Policy with unanimous support, I would point out, from the Senate and the House at that time, signed into law with the support of business groups and all sorts of other advocacy organizations, driven by environmental organizations, clean energy advocates, a broad coalition that came together, the utilities as well, who came together to say, we know this is the right thing to do, we know these are the tools that we need to do it. So within that, we changed the reimbursement rate in the net metering program from the wholesale electricity rate to the retail electricity rate. I would remind folks that in the years leading up to the passage of that legislation, we had in sum total in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts 2 megawatts of solar energy. Today, nearly 8 years after that legislation was signed into law and implemented, Massachusetts has 985 megawatts of solar energy installed in nearly every one of the 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have seen significant energy benefit from those investments. We have seen significant environmental benefit from those investments in clean energy, and we have seen significant economic benefit. In 2007, there were 50 solar companies in Massachusetts. There are now north of 270 solar companies in Massachusetts. We now have north of 12,000 employees in the solar energy industry here in Massachusetts, And increasingly, those companies are not just doing business in Massachusetts, but they are doing business in Connecticut and Rhode Island out of their headquarters here in Massachusetts. So along with those changes in net metering and the allowable size of the project, it should also be pointed out that the economics of solar changed generally. We had significant investments made by the federal government under the Obama administration. We had changes in the international market. So there were significant changes over the last 8 years that have allowed us to deploy a significant amount of solar energy across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Mr. President, I mentioned several reimbursement rates in my opening remarks. It's worth pointing out what those rates are. Right now, the reimbursement for the retail rate in Massachusetts is 17 cents a kilowatt hour. Previously, we had reimbursed net metering at the wholesale electric rate, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, or 71% less than the retail rate where we are right now. Before us today, what we had was legislation that had been sent over from the House that would address the pressing issue that is before us of the net metering caps. As we all know, there are two caps that were first established in law in the Green Communities Act, but have subsequently been raised in 2010, 12, and 14 due to the success of those programs. Under the legislation from the House, we would again raise the caps 2%. I should add also that Governor Baker has filed legislation that would also raise those caps 2%. It would bring the private cap to 6% of peak load. It would bring the public cap to 7% of each utility service territory's peak load. That is the main reason why we are here right now. We have hit those caps in the National Grid service territory. We are running up against them in the Eversource territory, those two utility territory areas covering the majority of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We know that those caps at this point, or not lifting them, will stifle the growth of solar across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we know that we need to lift them. We also know that with the federal investment tax credit for 30% of eligible expenses poised to expire on December 31st of 2016, we need to do what we can at the state level to take advantage of that credit and to make sure that projects that are poised to be developed throughout the communities that we represent have the opportunity to avail themselves of that credit. Right? So we are here both because of the cap, and we are here because of the potential expiration of a key incentive that has helped Massachusetts be a part of that transition from 2 megawatts of solar energy to north of 950 megawatts of solar energy. There has been a good deal of discussion and debate about the amount that we spend on solar here in Massachusetts, about the cost. There hasn't been, from my perspective, enough discussion also of the benefits. I believe that the Senate recognized that the benefits of solar far outweigh the cost when we took the action that we took in July to raise the caps to try and deal with this issue. So now we have legislation that is before us. The bill, as it came over from the House, would change the reimbursement rates for solar energy here in Massachusetts. That is not something that was in the legislation as an amendment that was sent over to the House originally. How would it change those reimbursement rates? The bill that the House passed yesterday would take the reimbursement rate for retail reimbursement rate and only keep that for small residential, commercial, and industrial users. That is something that we ought to support. That's a good thing. However, the House brought down the reimbursement rate for all remaining projects to the wholesale electricity rate. As I said earlier, the difference between the retail rate and the wholesale rate is 12 cents, or more accurately, it is 71%. What we have heard consistently from clean energy advocates, from business groups, from environmental organizations and others is that while there may be some need for changing the program, that is too much of a reduction. I would also point out it is a more significant reduction than what was proposed by the governor in the legislation that he filed. In the legislation the governor filed, they, along with preserving the protection for residential and small commercial and industrial users, also had a special consideration for low-income projects, for public projects, and for community-shared solar projects, which are incredibly important for the 70+% of residences that don't have roofs that are situated so that they have the opportunity to take advantage of solar. Now, in the governor's legislation, that would be reimbursed at the basic service rate, which is 8 cents compared to the 17 cents that they receive under the retail rate. Roughly speaking, a 53% reduction in the incentive for those projects, although still better than the 71% reduction envisioned in other proposals. It's worth pointing out that net metering is only 1/3 of the support that we provide for solar projects here in Massachusetts. There has been, again, a good deal of discussion from the utilities, from business groups and others, saying that Massachusetts spends too much money on solar. I would say this. First, you can't just look at the costs. None of us would support many of the projects that we support in our districts if all we looked at were the costs. If all we looked at were the costs of building a new high school in Lynn, if all we looked at were the costs of building a new hospital in Taunton, if all we looked at were the costs of building a new bridge in Newburyport, then none of us would support those efforts. It is about balancing the costs and the benefits of those investments that we call for at any given time. I firmly believe that the benefits of clean energy, whether we are talking about solar, about wind, about anaerobic digestion, whether we are talking about any form of clean energy, the benefits of the investments that are made in it far outstrip the cost short-term to ratepayers and to taxpayers. But that does not mean that the policies that we have in place are perfect. That does not mean that they can't be improved to maximize those benefits and to minimize those costs. I should also point out at this time that after last session, when we raised the net metering cap in 2014, we established a net metering task force. That task force, which had participation from many members of this body, had participation from the utilities, had participation from business groups, both those who support and those who oppose certain provisions of legislation in existing law. That task force found, the experts that we work with found, that the benefits of solar energy far outstrip its costs to the tune of 2.5% to 1. So for every $1 we invest in solar, we see $2.50 in benefits here in Massachusetts. I'm not a gambling man, Mr. President. I voted against expanded gambling. But I think that an investment in solar energy is no gamble. It is a wise and prudent investment for the Commonwealth to make. Given all of that, it is important to finish up in talking about the House's legislation. They changed the reimbursement rate while raising the cap 2%. They grandfathered projects under the existing reimbursement rate for up to 20 years, similar to what Governor Baker has proposed as well. The House also included a provision that would allow, if not require, the utilities to move forward with a minimum bill. All of those provisions are worthy of consideration and debate. I believe that the proposal that came over from the House is a good faith proposal to try and make sure that we continue the progress that we've made here on solar in Massachusetts, on climate change in Massachusetts. I think it is a good faith proposal to try and reduce the cost of those programs. That being said, I think that it goes too far on the cost side. I think the reimbursement rates, as they were imagined in that legislation, would have a negative impact on the ability for us to see projects that are currently proposed in our district continue to move forward. I think we could put at risk some of those benefits that we have seen accrue to our communities, whether they are public projects that have our communities getting more money into classrooms and into the police station and less money into their utility bills, that have people saving on their water rates or putting their neighbor to work, building a clean energy economy. I think it risks the continued development of those efforts. That does not mean that we cannot continue with those types of projects while making some changes. And so I bring before this body an amendment to the House's bill. I will say this at the beginning. This amendment is not my ideal. My ideal policy I think this body can be proud of, can defend, was the amendment that we sent to the House at the end of July. I absolutely believe that the programs as currently constructed are good for ratepayers. I believe they're good for the environment and good for the economy. But it is clear that both the House and the administration would like to change some of those programs. I also think it's clear that we could build on some of the work that the Net Metering Task Force and others have done to improve those programs. And so I make the following recommendations. On the net metering credit value, right? On the issue of how we reimburse net metering, like both the House and the governor has, I believe we ought to ensure that those solar projects that come under the small residential exemption and the small commercial and industrial exemption maintain the full retail rate. That ought to stay in place. That has been consistent policy across the board. I think for the group of projects, of types of projects that the governor has highlighted as being important, and I believe we also in the Senate believe deserve special recognition and special treatment, for low-income projects, for public projects, and for community-shared solar projects, we ought to have a reimbursement rate that is higher than either the House or the governor had envisioned. I would offer in the amendment that is before us that those projects receive a reimbursement rate at the retail rate minus distribution. The retail rate currently, as we said, is 17 cents a kilowatt hour. The retail rate minus distribution is 12 cents a kilowatt hour. I believe those projects can continue to move forward. That was actually included in legislation that the Telecommunications and Energy Committee moved out of its committee at the end of last session, which ultimately was scuttled. I believe those projects deserve that treatment. For all other projects, which both the House and the administration would reimburse at the wholesale rate, I believe at the very least we ought to reimburse them at the basic service rate, which is 8 cents a kilowatt hour compared to the 5 cents a kilowatt hour that both the House and the administration would reimburse those projects. Let me say again, I don't think that these changes are necessary to make our policy perfect. I think our existing policy is strong, defensible, and good. But it is clear that both the administration and the House are seeking changes. And I think if we were to draw a line in the Senate here, we could end up with absolutely no cap increase to the net metering program and truthfully threaten the growth of solar moving forward. So again, protect the residential and commercial and industrial exemption at the full retail rate. For low income community shared solar, and public projects, they will receive, under the amendment that is before the Senate right now, the retail electricity rate minus distribution, 12 cents compared to 17. For all other users, they will receive the basic service rate, 8 cents, which is a significant decrease from the 17 cents they receive today, and will certainly impact projects, but will certainly be far better than the 5-cent wholesale rate as envisioned both in Governor Baker's bill and in legislation as passed by the House. In legislation that I just referenced, both the House and the Governor bring up the issue of grandfathering. We have many of our constituents, our friends, our family members, many of our communities and businesses in our communities that have made investments in solar over the better part of the last decade. I don't think it is smart or wise for us to change the rules in the middle of the game on those who have made those investments. Again, that being said, the governor has filed legislation which would grandfather those rates for 20 years. So if a constituent of ours put solar up, they had it at, in 2008 at the retail rate. Under the House's legislation or under the governor's legislation, those rates would only be grandfathered till 2028. If they get in a solar project tomorrow, they would be grandfathered till 2035. While I understand the reason for it, I am deeply concerned about the idea of changing the rules in the middle of the game. Again, if the House and the governor have chosen this path, I think the least that we can do is to make sure that all projects that are in the pipeline now have the greatest degree of protection possible. So in the amendment that is before the Senate today, we would grandfather those projects for up to 30 years. So if you made an investment in 2008, that will be good, that reimbursement rate, for up till 2038. The same for if you get in the ground and you're interconnected and on today, it will move forward for 30 years until we change under the existing structure of the net metering credit value that I outlined before. Final point. In the Senate's amendment at the end of July, we raised the caps across the board to 1,600 megawatts throughout the state. In the governor's bill and in the bill the House sent back to us, they raised the caps 2% each. It is, by all accounts, pretty close, but that 2% and 2% could get us to 1,600. It, by all accounts, will not get us through the calendar year next year. I am recommending that we maintain the cap raise that both the governor and the House have put forward, that we raise the caps by 2% and 2% as well. You can make a compelling argument to go beyond that, and I can make a compelling argument to go beyond that. In fact, we did in July. But in the interest of trying to raise the caps in a timely fashion, it seems there is agreement here. I think no one should be under the illusion that we will be back at this again. We will be raising the caps again, or debating raising the caps again, in the late spring or the early summer of next year. That is why we need to get a long-term framework in place for solar that is consistent and allows it to develop. That is my recommendation, though, at this point to the Senate. There are several provisions that were included in the House bill that we leave out of the amendment to that bill that I have filed. They are as follows. The House raised the cap on the amount of solar that utilities could own and operate. As many folks here remember, in the Green Communities Act, for the first time since 1997, utilities were allowed to own and operate generation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, up to 25 megawatts of solar energy. In the bill that is before us, that would go up to 35 megawatts. I do not think that that is sound public policy. It is not included in my amendment. I do not think it is needed. We have a robust, efficient, and effective fleet of over 270 solar companies in Massachusetts. We do not need our monopoly utilities, who have, in many cases, pointed out their skepticism about the role of solar, We do not need them owning and generating their own. Also, not in the amendment that is before us is any mention of a minimum bill. This is an issue that has been debated throughout the country at this point, debated at public utility commissions, debated in legislatures across the country. I do not believe that a minimum bill is wise public policy in a vacuum. You may be able to make a case for some consideration if we were looking at utility rates writ large, trying to figure out how we could make a sustainable business model for the clean energy industry, for utilities writ large, not unlike, quite frankly, what is going on in New York State right now. However, I don't think that we should include that in this bill. So there is no mention of a minimum bill in the amendment to the House bill that is coming out of the Senate. It should be said that the utilities are currently filing rate cases before the Department of Public Utilities. In those rate cases, in one that is already there and potentially others soon, there is consideration of a minimum bill. If the utilities believe that is important, they ought to go make the case to the Department of Public Utilities, which is the proper venue for the consideration of that. So again, we changed the net metering credit value here in the Senate, not because we think it is absolutely the right thing to do, but because we are trying to come up with a cap raise bill that meets all of our shared goals. We believe that our net metering credit value, or at least I believe, I don't want to be presumptuous, I believe the net metering credit value that we have will ensure that solar continues to move forward, and in particular the types of projects that we want to see will continue to move forward. By grandfathering projects for a longer time period, by grandfathering projects for up to or for 30 years, I think we will make sure that people who made investments based on the action of this legislature will not find the rug pulled out from underneath them. So by making these changes, my hope is that we will get the net metering cap raise that we need in the short term, and that we will do so in a way that does not threaten the leadership of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have been and we must remain a leader in clean energy, not just because it's good for the economy, not just because we've gone from 50 to 270 solar companies in the Commonwealth, not just because there are 12,000 solar energy jobs in Massachusetts, not just because it's a fun talking point, but because this is the way that we combat climate change. This is how we do it, by investing in clean energy, by building on the investments that we've made in energy efficiency, by doubling or quadrupling down, as the Senate President Pro Tem from Taunton would say, in all of those investments. We don't do this just because we think it's a fun thing to do. We all know there are plenty of other pressing issues before us. Economic issues, issues of criminal justice reform, healthcare costs. We do this because we want to be able to look back at this moment. And when future generations look back and say, when were we able to start stemming the tide of climate change? When were we able to start showing that we don't have to make a false choice between the economy and the environment? This is when we started doing it. We have done it in Massachusetts for the last 8 years. It is healthy to debate how we do it moving forward. But no one should debate if we are going to continue to do it. I believe the amendment that is before us here gets us there. I am concerned, in closing, that if we go much further from the amendment as has been filed and offered here today to the House bill, that we will threaten that leadership. We cannot go farther. We need to raise the caps. We need to do so expeditiously. I believe this is the way to do it. Going much further to the wholesale rate on net metering or playing around on the edges in other ways, I think threatens that leadership. I think it threatens solar in Massachusetts. And I don't think that's anything that anyone in the Senate, in the House, or in this administration wants to do. We all care too much. We share these same common goals. So, Mr. President, with that, I would ask that when a vote is taken, that there is broad support for this effort. Thank you very much.
Chair.